The room is quiet now. Whatever the day held, the meetings, the small frustrations, the decisions you kept turning over on your commute home, it is somewhere behind you, or mostly behind you. Because if you are anything like most people, the mind does not simply stop when the body does. You know this feeling. The moment you finally slow down, something inside gets louder. Tonight, we are going to understand why that happens. And more than that, you are going to spend the next few hours with a man who wrestled with the same thing every single night of his life. His name was Marcus Aurelius. He was Roman emperor for nearly 20 years, from 161 to 180 CE. He governed an empire of 40 to 70 million people. Historians still debate the exact number. Commanded armies on 3 fronts simultaneously, and administered a legal system that stretched from the hills of Scotland to the deserts of Syria. And yet, when he sat alone at night with his lamp and his journal, he was not writing about power. He was writing about peace. Not the peace of a man who has finally gotten everything he wants. Not the peace of silence or safety or absence. The peace of someone who has learned, slowly, imperfectly, over decades of failure and returning, how to hold a restless mind gently enough that it eventually stills. There is a question he kept returning to, the one that ran beneath almost everything he wrote, the question we will sit with tonight. Can a person find genuine inner peace while living inside a life they did not choose? That may feel familiar. Most of us did not choose the pressures we carry. We did not design the families we were born into, the expectations placed on us without our permission, the fears that arrived one ordinary Tuesday and never quite left. And yet here we are, trying to find stillness inside lives that keep moving. Marcus spent over 20 years writing his way toward an answer, and the answer was not what he expected. There is a detail in his journals that most people overlook, and we will come back to it. It changes everything about how you read him. Let your shoulders drop just slightly. You are not expected to do anything right now. By the time Marcus became emperor, Rome had already stretched itself thin. To the north, Germanic tribes were pressing against the Danube River. To the east, a war with the Parthian Empire had already begun under his predecessor. The Antonine Plague, a disease that some historians now believe was smallpox, was moving across the provinces, thinning populations and exhausting the supply lines that fed distant legions. And Marcus Aurelius, a man who had spent his youth reading philosophy in quiet rooms, was expected to hold all of it together. He did not hide from this. That much history makes clear. He led campaigns personally. He sat in judgment halls for long hours each day, listening to petitions, settling disputes, appointing governors to regions he would never visit himself. But what history also records in his own handwriting is that he never stopped asking himself how to do all of this without losing himself in the doing. The Stoic teacher Epictetus had written a generation before Marcus about what he called the inner citadel, the fortress of the self. The idea was simple and strange at once. Your body can be harmed, your plans can collapse, your circumstances can be taken from you entirely. But the part of you that chooses how to respond to all of it, that remains yours, always. No one can enter that room without your permission. Marcus read Epictetus as a young man. He returned to those ideas again and again throughout his life. Epictetus had been born into slavery, a condition Marcus could hardly imagine given the marble halls he had grown up in. And yet, the formerly enslaved philosopher arrived at a kind of inner freedom that Marcus, surrounded by imperial power, found genuinely difficult to reach. That contrast matters. It tells us something important about peace. Peace is not given to those with the most power. It is not the reward of comfort or safety. It is the result of something quieter and harder, a decision made again and again about where you place your attention. Something shifts when you see it from that angle. We begin there, in the attempt, in the dark, in a world that offered Marcus Aurelius no particular reason for calm. And we will ask, together tonight, whether the same attempt is available to you. Chapter 2, Marcus Aurelius and the Restless Soul. He was not supposed to become a philosopher. That is the first thing to understand about Marcus Aurelius. He came from a family of public service. His grandfather had been a consul 3 times, a respected administrator in the Roman tradition. The expectation for Marcus was governance, duty, a career shaped by obligation, not reflection. And then, at age 11, something happened. He encountered philosophy. Not the kind of philosophy taught in clean lecture halls with clear answers, the old kind, the kind that asks hard questions and then refuses to let you put them down. His early tutor was a man named Fronto, one of the finest Latin stylists of the era. Fronto taught Marcus rhetoric, the art of persuasion, the careful architecture of public speech. He was brilliant at it. But Marcus was already restless in ways that rhetoric could not satisfy. By his teenage years, he had found the Stoics. Not through books alone, but through a philosopher named Junius Rusticus, who gave him his own personal copy of the lectures of Epictetus. That copy, according to the meditations themselves, changed Marcus permanently. He wrote of Rusticus with something close to reverence, not because Rusticus had taught him what to think, but because Rusticus had shown him how to question, how to sit with a difficult idea without rushing toward resolution, how to return to the same problem again and again until something real emerged. This is not a common skill. Most of us, when we encounter a problem, an anxiety, a regret, a question we cannot answer, we move quickly. We distract ourselves, or we try to solve it, or we push it beneath the level of consciousness where it keeps working on us anyway. Marcus learned something different. He learned to stay. Let the breath settle for a moment. Just notice the rise and fall of it. The Meditations, the private journal that survives as his most important legacy, was almost certainly begun during his military campaigns along the Danube River in the 170s CE. He was in his 50s by then. Tired, grieving, surrounded by war and disease. He wrote, not for publication, not for anyone else's eyes. He wrote the way a person writes when they need to hear something said clearly in order to believe it. Researchers and classicists who have studied the Meditations, among them the scholar Gregory Hayes, who produced one of the most readable modern translations, note that Marcus often seems to be arguing with himself, reminding himself of things he knows intellectually but has not yet managed to feel. This is important because it means Marcus was not someone who had already achieved peace and was writing it down as a record. He was someone who was still trying. Night after night, year after year, in cold military tents and warm imperial rooms and the quiet hours between the demands of empire, he kept trying. And here is the thing that quietly changes how you see all of this. His restlessness was not a failure of philosophy. It was the practice of it. A thought, if you let it land. A soul that has learned to rest does not mean a soul that has stopped asking. There is a kind of tiredness that sleep cannot fix. It comes not from the body, but from something deeper, from the accumulated weight of what we carry when no one is watching. Marcus knew this tiredness well. He wrote about it, circled it, pressed at it from different angles across 12 books of private notes. And he kept going. Not because the restlessness left, but because he learned, slowly, to stop fighting it. That distinction between pushing away the restless feeling and learning to move alongside it is one of the quieter gifts the Meditations offers. And it is one we will return to. Chapter 3. Why an Emperor Needed Philosophy. Imagine being handed the largest responsibility you have ever faced. Not a project at work, not a difficult family situation. Something on a scale that makes your current pressures feel, for a moment, manageable by comparison. Now imagine being handed that responsibility while already knowing that no one has ever done it perfectly. While knowing that the people who came before you, some of them brilliant, some of them ruthless, all of them eventually failing, left you a set of problems they could not solve. That was the position Marcus Aurelius woke up in every morning. And philosophy was not a hobby for him. It was not the philosophical equivalent of a weekend retreat. It was how he survived. Before he became emperor, Marcus had studied philosophy for nearly 2 decades. He had absorbed the Stoics, Zeno, Chrysippus, Cleanthes, and most especially Epictetus, along with earlier Greek thinkers whose ideas still circulated in the educated Roman world. He had studied Plato. He had read widely in ethics and logic, but when the weight of empire fell on him, he did not reach for the complex theoretical frameworks. He reached for the simple things, the daily questions, the nightly review, the practice of asking each morning, what might go wrong today, and how will I respond if it does? The Stoics called this premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity. It sounds grim, but its purpose was not pessimism, it was preparation. If you have already imagined losing what you value most, if you have already sat with that possibility and found that you could bear it, that your core self would survive it, then when difficulty arrives, it arrives into a mind that has already done some of the work. Marcus used this practice every day, and it did not make the difficulty go away. It made it smaller, or more precisely, it made him larger than the difficulty, in a quiet way that did not require performance. Hold that thought gently, because something returns from it later in the evening. There is a detail about how Marcus approached governance that Pierre Hadot, the French philosopher who devoted decades of scholarship to understanding Marcus, describes as essential. In his book, The Inner Citadel, Hadot argues that Marcus did not think of Stoic philosophy as a set of doctrines to believe. He thought of it as a set of exercises to perform. The distinction matters enormously. Believing something and practicing something are not the same. A person can believe that anger is unproductive and still lose their temper. A person can believe that this moment is enough and still spend every evening reviewing what they should have done differently. What Marcus was attempting, what he wrote in his journal night after night, was to close that gap. Not through willpower, not through discipline in the punishing sense. Through repetition, through return, through the patient work of bringing his actual behavior closer to his understanding of what he valued. This is why he needed philosophy the way other people need water. Not as an intellectual decoration, as a daily practice of becoming more himself. Now, there is something Marcus made, one decision he arrived at only late in his life, after years of war and loss, that reveals something about him most people miss entirely. We will come back to that. But for now, know that it is not what you would expect from an emperor, and it is the most useful thing he ever did. Chapter 4. The Burden of Power at Night. The lamp is small. That is the first thing to understand about how Marcus Aurelius wrote. He did not write in a grand imperial library surrounded by shelves of scrolls and marble busts. He wrote, most often, by the light of a single oil lamp in a military tent or a private chamber, writing quickly in Greek, the language he associated with philosophy and inner life rather than with public governance. The words he put down were not polished. They were not written with a reader in mind. They were written because the alternative, not writing them, was unbearable. Imagine a clock reading 3 a.m. and your mind running calculations it will not stop making. Not about anything that can be solved right now. Just the same considerations, circling. Marcus Aurelius knew that feeling. Except the calculations in his mind involved armies and plagues and border territories, and whether the general he had appointed in the north was trustworthy, and whether the supply routes to the Eastern Front would hold, and whether the child he had lost last year had experienced pain in his final hours, personal grief and imperial crisis sharing the same sleepless night. He wrote about this, not explicitly, but in the way a person's journal reveals what they cannot stop thinking about. He returned, again and again, to the question of what was truly in his power and what was not. He returned to the problem of anger, not other people's anger, but his own. He returned to the question of whether he had done enough good that day to justify the time he had been given. This is not a small thing to recognize. Here was a man who commanded the most powerful empire the Western world had seen to that point. And in private, he was asking the same questions you ask. Am I doing enough? Am I being what I should be? Is any of this actually making a difference? The body knows this kind of tiredness. Let it rest for a moment. Notice the contact between you and whatever is beneath you. The philosopher Irvin Yalom, who spent decades as a psychiatrist helping people face their deepest anxieties, wrote that behind most of what we struggle with at night lies a small number of fundamental fears. The fear of death, the fear of freedom, the dizzying responsibility of being the author of your own life, the fear of isolation, the fear that in the end nothing truly means what we need it to mean. Marcus Aurelius had all four, and he did not pretend otherwise. That is perhaps the most striking thing about the Meditations. He does not pretend to have conquered these fears. He writes as someone who encounters them repeatedly, who sometimes handles them well and sometimes does not, who needs to be reminded of the same things over and over because knowing is not the same as having integrated. "You could leave life right now," he wrote at one point. "Let that determine what you do and say and think." He was writing that to himself as a reminder, as a prod. The man who wrote that line was afraid. Not of death exactly. Stoic training had given him a kind of acceptance of mortality that most of us work a lifetime to find. He was afraid of wasted time, of squandering the hours, of getting to the end and discovering that the thing he had chased, the calm, the peace, the settled sense of having been true to something, had remained just out of reach. And here is the paradox that runs through his journals like a quiet current. The man who feared wasted time wrote one of the most enduring documents in Western philosophy. The man who doubted whether he was doing enough became evidence 2,000 years later that the trying itself is the point. We will stay with that paradox for a while tonight. It has something to say to you. Chapter 5, Meditations as a Private Lifeline. In 1558, a Florentine scholar named Wilhelm Holtzmann acquired a manuscript. It was ancient, in poor condition, and written in Greek, which made it unusual even for a Latin-saturated intellectual culture that still valued classical education. When he examined it, he realized what he had. It was the private journal of Marcus Aurelius. The manuscript had survived nearly 1,400 years by pure accident. It was not preserved because anyone knew it was important. It circulated quietly, copied by monks and scholars who recognized that it contained something worth keeping, without necessarily knowing what to do with it. Holtzmann published it, and slowly, over the next 2 centuries, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius became one of the most widely read philosophical texts in the world. None of that would have happened if Marcus had known anyone would read it. That is the remarkable thing about the Meditations. It was not written for us. It was not written for posterity, for reputation, for the judgment of history. It was written the way you write at the end of a very long day when you need to hear something said clearly in order to believe it. Story card 03 from the Story Bank captures something true about this. Imagine a man in a Roman military tent at the edge of the known world by candlelight writing not commands but questions. He commands millions and yet cannot command his own restlessness. He picks up his stylus, He writes one sentence to himself: "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." He was not writing philosophy. He was writing a lifeline. Something about that feels familiar if you let it. The modern historian Donald Robertson, who spent years studying the psychology behind Marcus Aurelius and wrote How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, observes that the Meditations reads like a series of cognitive exercises. Marcus was not recording insights he had arrived at and left behind. He was performing exercises, Stoic mental drills, that he needed to repeat because the needs they addressed kept returning. This is both humbling and deeply reassuring. Humbling because it shows that even someone of Marcus's intelligence and philosophical training did not simply learn equanimity and keep it. He had to practice it daily, the way a musician practices scales. Reassuring because it means the path to peace is not a one-time crossing. It is a daily practice. And you are allowed to still be practicing. You are allowed to need reminding. Let your breath find its own rhythm for a moment. You do not need to make it deeper or slower. There is something almost tender about reading the Meditations, knowing what we know about their origin. Marcus wrote things like, "This is the nature of things, and it does not matter," and "begin again," lines that read almost like a parent speaking gently to a frightened child. The frightened child was himself. He was his own most important student, and his curriculum was not philosophy in the abstract. It was the daily challenge of being a decent person inside a life of enormous complexity. Pierre Hadot, in The Inner Citadel, describes what he calls the spiritual exercises of Marcus, a phrase he borrows from the Jesuit tradition but applies here to the Stoic practice of self-examination, self-correction, and self-preparation. These exercises were not meditations in the passive sense. They were active, deliberate, almost combative. But combative against what? Not against other people, not against circumstance, against the parts of himself that wanted to shrink, to complain, to resent, to despair. He fought those parts not with self-criticism, but with patient repetition. And here is the small detail in his journals that most people miss, the thing we will come back to later tonight. The fact that after all those years of writing, "Begin again," and "It does not matter," and "This is the nature of things," the tone of his journal very gradually changes. Something settles. Not because the circumstances got easier, because something in him did. We will get there. But now, let us stay with the practice itself. Chapter 6, Duty Without Inner Collapse. There is a man in his 50s who has worked the same job for 30 years. He does not love it anymore. He is not sure he ever did, exactly, but he is good at it. And people depend on him, his team, his department, the organization that would notice his absence within 48 hours. Every morning he gets up and he goes. He meets the needs of others with professional steadiness. He comes home and he is tired in a way that sleep does not quite fix. What he needs is not rest exactly. It is permission to feel that the duty he has given his life to is meaningful and sometimes, on the hardest nights, a way to feel that even when he is not sure it is. Marcus Aurelius would have understood this man completely. Duty, for Marcus, was not a choice he had made. It was a condition he had been born into, shaped for, and finally handed without asking. The Stoic philosophers had taught him that this was, in some sense, irrelevant. The role you are given does not determine the person you become. How you inhabit the role does. Epictetus had written, and Marcus had absorbed, the idea that life is like a play. The author has assigned you your part. Yours is not to choose the part, but to perform it excellently. A short part performed with excellence is better than a long part performed carelessly. This sounds, at first, like resignation, like the philosophy of someone who has given up. But there is a quieter layer beneath that. The Stoics did not teach resignation. They taught something more demanding and, ultimately, more freeing. They taught that the quality of your inner state, the care you bring to whatever you are doing, is always within your power. Always. Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius about a very similar problem of busyness and exhaustion, observed something that still cuts through clearly. It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it. He was not criticizing his friend. He was describing a trap they both recognized. The trap is this: we spend our energy fighting the conditions of our life rather than inhabiting them fully. We resist the role rather than bringing ourselves to it, and the resistance costs more than the role does. Marcus found a different path through this, not by becoming less dutiful, but by bringing philosophy into the duty itself. He described it in one of his more personal passages as finding the work of a human being inside the work of an emperor. The human work, the practice of attention, of fairness, of self-correction, of treating each person as worthy of care, was nested inside the imperial work. One did not have to stop to do the other. And this, quietly, is the thing that kept him from inner collapse. Not that he felt good about his circumstances, not that he did not struggle or resent or despair at times, but that he found a small, clean act of meaning inside whatever the day required of him. That is available to all of us. Notice the weight of your body just for a moment, the solidity of the surface beneath you. The question it raises is not, how do I find more meaningful work? The question is smaller and more immediate than that. What is the human work hidden inside whatever you are already doing? Think of what that looks like in practice. The meeting that feels purely procedural but contains, if you look, the opportunity to hear someone who has not been heard. The task that feels purely mechanical but requires, if you pay attention, the quiet craft of doing something well. The interaction that feels purely transactional but carries, if you bring your full self to it, the possibility of genuine recognition between two people who would otherwise pass each other without contact. Marcus called this action taken in accordance with nature, which for the Stoics meant action taken in accordance with what a rational, social, interconnected human being actually is. Not the role, the being, underneath the role. And this, the Stoics argued, was where virtue actually lived. Not in the grand gesture, not in the public performance, in the grain of the daily act. Epictetus had described virtue as something that does not need special conditions to exist. He demonstrated this with his own life. Born into slavery, denied every external advantage, and yet practicing in precisely those conditions what he would later teach to students who had traveled long distances for the privilege of hearing him. Marcus had every external advantage, and he was using the same practice, not to prove something to anyone else, to become something more fully himself. The person of genuine character is not the one who performs virtue when circumstances make it easy. They are the one who continues it when the circumstances argue against it. Marcus asked himself this every morning and reviewed his answer every night. Marcus asked this in a tent by the Danube, 50 years old, exhausted by war. The question is still worth asking. Chapter 7. Anxiety in the Roman Mind. The Romans did not have a word for anxiety in the way we use it now. They had anxiety, obviously. They felt it the way all human beings feel it, in the chest, in the stomach, in the small hours of the night when the mind will not stop moving. But they did not medicalize it. They did not categorize it as a condition that needed treatment. They categorized it as a philosophical problem, which meant they approached it philosophically. Marcus Aurelius, in his journals, returns repeatedly to something the Stoics called perturbationes, disturbances of the soul, unnecessary emotional movements. Not all emotions were disturbances. Grief over a real loss was appropriate. Caution in the face of genuine danger was appropriate. What was not appropriate, in the Stoic view, was the emotion that had no actual object, the fear of something that had not happened, the distress over something that could not be changed, the anger at something that was, in the largest sense, simply the way things are. Epictetus had said it clearly. Man is not worried by real problems so much as by his imagined anxieties about real problems. Think about the last time your mind was loudest at night. Chances are it was not running calculations about a problem you could solve right then. It was running calculations about problems that might occur, or that had already occurred and could not be undone, or that were simply the permanent conditions of being alive. That is, imagined anxiety over real problems. And Marcus wrote about it constantly, not with judgment, with recognition. There is a modern scene that fits here. A person lies in bed at 2 a.m., running through everything they owe: money, time, attention, apologies. The list never ends. The debt feels infinite. They are not doing math. They are trying to feel in control. Nighttime anxiety is rarely about the items on the list. It is about the feeling of falling behind something that has no finish line. Marcus Aurelius would have recognized that person. He wrote about his own sleeplessness, his own circular worrying, his own tendency to turn the same concerns over and over until the turning itself became the problem. And his response was not to dismiss the concerns. He did not tell himself that his worries were stupid or that he should simply stop having them. His response was to locate the source. Every disturbance, he wrote, comes from a judgment we are making, not from the thing itself, from the story we are telling about the thing. A plague moving across the empire is a fact. The belief that this plague means everything you have built is worthless, that is a judgment. And judgments can be examined. They can be questioned. They can sometimes be revised. Let your shoulders soften just a little. You are here. Nothing is required of you this moment. This was not cold logic. It was a practical tool. And it worked not by eliminating anxiety, but by giving it a manageable size, by finding the edge of it, by discovering that the fear, examined directly, was not infinite. It had a shape. And shapes, unlike formless dread, can be held. We will look more closely at how Marcus developed this tool across the next few chapters. But for now, just notice. Is there a thought circling somewhere behind your listening tonight? You do not need to solve it. Just notice that it has a shape and that you are larger than the shape. Chapter 8. What Stoic calm really means. There is a misunderstanding about Stoicism that has become almost impossible to correct. The misunderstanding is this: Stoics do not feel things. They suppress emotion. They go through life with a kind of cold marble efficiency, untouched by difficulty, indifferent to suffering, operating like philosophy machines rather than human beings. This is exactly wrong. And Marcus Aurelius, who is perhaps the most human of all the Stoic philosophers, precisely because his private notes survived, makes it impossible to sustain. He grieved the deaths of several of his children. He and his wife Faustina had at least 14 children, and many of them died in infancy or childhood. He wrote about the loss of friends. He described the specific texture of exhaustion, not merely physical tiredness, but the kind that comes from years of sustained effort without clear result. He was a man of deep feeling. What the Stoics actually taught about emotion was something more subtle and more useful than suppression. They distinguished between two kinds of emotional experience. The first they called proto-passions. These are the involuntary initial responses, the flinch when something startles you, the pang when you hear difficult news, the flash of irritation when someone is rude. These are not in your control. They are physiological. They are human. The Stoics did not ask you to prevent them. The second kind is what happens when you take a proto-passion and act on it, or amplify it, or build a whole story around it. That second movement, the decision to pursue the anger, to feed the fear, to nurse the grief beyond what it naturally requires, that is what the Stoics asked you to examine. Epictetus put it simply: it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. He was not saying, do not feel. He was saying, the feeling that arrives is not the only thing that gets to happen. Story card 04 from the Story Bank illuminates this. Imagine Epictetus, the philosopher who was once enslaved, in a small room with his only lamp. A student arrives and finds the room dark. The lamp has been stolen. The student asks if he is upset. Epictetus considers the question. The loss is real. He will use a clay dish tomorrow. The suffering is optional, not because suffering is invalid, but because the lamp is already gone, and additional suffering does not restore it. Something shifts when you hear it said that plainly. There is a kind of calm Marcus was working toward that has nothing to do with not caring. He cared enormously about his family, about the people under his administration, about whether he was living rightly. The calm he was building was something different. It was the ability to continue caring deeply about real things while not being undone by the things that could not be helped. That is a distinction worth sitting with. Feel the weight of your body against what is beneath you. Let your breath move slowly. Brené Brown, the researcher who spent years studying vulnerability and what she called wholehearted living, found something that resonates here. The people she interviewed who seemed most at peace were not the ones who had learned to feel less. They were the ones who had learned to feel clearly, to distinguish between real loss and imagined catastrophe, between genuine connection and performed happiness. Marcus Aurelius was doing the same work 1800 years earlier by lamplight. And the remarkable thing, the thing that quietly reframes everything about his story, is that the calm he was building was not a destination. It was a practice, one he never finished, one that kept requiring his return, and returning each time was the point. Chapter 9. The first battle is judgment. There is a moment, usually several times a day, that most people do not notice. Something happens, a word is said, a message arrives, someone cuts in front of you, someone fails to notice something you needed them to see. And in the fraction of a second before your response, there is a gap. The Stoics built an entire philosophy around that gap. They called the initial impression, the raw experience of perception before any interpretation, a fantasia. It is the direct sensory data. Something happened. Your senses registered it. What happens next is not automatic. It is a judgment. You decide, consciously or not, what that event means, whether it is dangerous, whether it is an insult, whether it is something to pursue or avoid or fear. And that judgment, Marcus Aurelius understood, was where almost all of his real work happened. Not in the campaigns or the courtrooms or the appointment of governors. The most consequential work of his life happened in that fraction of a second between impression and response. He wrote about this with unusual precision. He described the practice of pausing, not physically, but mentally, at the moment of first impression, before adding interpretation. Of examining what had actually occurred before deciding what it meant. This is harder than it sounds, because the interpretations arrive so quickly and with such apparent certainty that they feel like facts. Someone does not respond to your message. Your mind tells you they are ignoring you, that they are angry, that you have done something wrong, that you are not important enough to warrant their time. None of that is in the event. The event is no response yet. Everything else is judgment. And here is the small detail that changes it. The judgment is always revisable. That is the part that makes this livable rather than merely philosophical. Marcus was not asking himself to suspend all judgment forever. He was asking himself to hold judgments lightly enough that new information could change them. A person who holds their judgments loosely can be wrong and then be right. A person who treats their interpretations as facts is stuck. Consider a moment from your own life. An argument you replayed in your mind. In the shower, on a commute, in the minutes before sleep finally came. You kept revising your lines, sharpening your points, making the argument you wished you had made in the moment. But notice, in that replay, the other person never got to respond. You were arguing against a judgment, a fixed interpretation of what they meant and who they were. Marcus practiced something different. He tried, in the aftermath of difficult interactions, to revise the judgment itself rather than the argument inside it. Maybe the person who angered him was afraid. Maybe they were tired. Maybe they were doing the best they could with what they had, which was less than he had, and the anger he felt was aimed at something that deserved more understanding than condemnation. This is not naive. He was not asking himself to pretend that bad behavior was good behavior. He was asking himself to hold his interpretations carefully before building a life around them. Let your jaw soften for a moment. The Buddhist tradition, which arrived at some similar places from a very different direction, speaks of what they call beginner's mind, approaching each moment fresh, without the weight of previous classification. Marcus would not have used that phrase. But he was practicing something very close to it. Each new moment could carry a different judgment than the last one. That openness, humble, disciplined, never complete, was where his freedom lived. There is something worth pausing on in the phrase humble, disciplined, never complete, never complete. Marcus did not expect to finish the practice of keeping his judgments loose and revisable. He expected to keep practicing it. The journal was not a record of progress toward a final state. It was the practice itself, in written form, giving him the repetition the work required. And here is what that kind of sustained practice produces over years. Not perfection, something more reliable than perfection. A habit of pausing, a built-in question that fires before the judgment solidifies. Is this accurate? Is this the full picture? What have I assumed that I have not verified? The habit is not a guarantee. Tired people fall back on old judgments. Frightened people contract into certainty because certainty feels safer than openness. Marcus did both. But he returned, always returned. And the returning, practiced long enough, becomes the reflex, not the perfect judgment. There is no such thing, the honest one. And here, quietly, is the question that follows. What judgment are you carrying tonight that you built so long ago you have forgotten it is a judgment? Chapter 10. Why Thoughts Disturb the Soul. A thought arrives. You are not doing anything in particular, resting maybe, trying to sleep, and then, without invitation, a thought arrives, usually one you have had before, usually one that carries a specific emotional texture, usually one that arrives at the exact moment when you were nearly somewhere else. Marcus Aurelius had a word for this, several words in fact. He was deeply interested in the mechanics of thought, how thoughts form, why certain ones recur, what it means when a thought returns again and again despite your efforts to set it aside. His central observation was deceptively simple. Thoughts disturb the soul not because of what they are, but because of the power we grant them. We grant that power through what the Stoics called synkatathesis, the act of giving assent, of saying yes to a thought, of not just experiencing an impression, but endorsing it, following it, letting it become the organizing principle of your response. A thought about a fear of illness, of failure, of loss arrives. If you grant it assent, it becomes more than a thought. It becomes a forecast, a plan, a conviction, and you behave accordingly. If you observe it without granting assent, it remains what it actually is, a neurological event, a signal, information, not instruction. Psychologist Ethan Kross, who has spent years studying what he calls chatter, the inner voice that runs almost constantly in the human mind, found that one of the most effective ways to manage distressing thoughts is to create a small psychological distance from them, to step back from inside the thought and observe it from slightly outside. Kross discovered that even a small shift in language, moving from "I am anxious" to "I notice there is anxiety," changes how the brain processes the experience. The first formulation pulls you inside it. The second creates room to breathe. Marcus Aurelius had arrived at something very similar nearly 2,000 years earlier. He practiced describing his experiences in plain, material terms rather than charged emotional ones. Not, "This is unbearable," but "This is difficult." Not, "I am a failure," but "This particular effort did not succeed." He was not minimizing. He was reducing the psychological weight of interpretations down to facts he could actually work with. And in doing so, he gave himself room. There is nothing to change right now. Just let the next breath arrive on its own. The modern researcher and author Bessel van der Kolk has written extensively about how the body holds the stress of repeated thoughts, how the physiological response to a recurring anxious thought is real, physical, felt in the muscles and the nervous system long after the thought itself has moved on. Marcus did not have this language, but he was writing about the same territory. He wrote about the importance of not adding to the suffering that life inevitably brought, not adding layers of judgment, story, and catastrophe to events that were already difficult enough. He called this keeping your ruling faculty, the hegemonikon, the governing part of the mind, clear, not empty, clear, available, capable of seeing what was actually there rather than being flooded by what it feared might be there. There is a reason this feels familiar tonight. because the thoughts that keep you awake are rarely about facts you cannot live with. They are about stories, interpretations, projections, rehearsals that your mind generates around those facts. And the stories are always revisable, even the oldest ones. Chapter 11. The Discipline of Assent. Marcus Aurelius began each day with a specific practice. He called it, in various passages of the Meditations, morning preparation. But the content of that preparation was not a checklist or a schedule review. It was a philosophical exercise. He would remind himself, before getting out of bed, of what the day was likely to require of him. Not the logistics of governance, but the inner requirements. He anticipated that he would encounter people who were difficult, ungrateful, dishonest, or simply exhausting. He reminded himself of this not to brace against it, but to prepare for it with the right orientation. He would think something like, "These people are doing what they know how to do. Their behavior is shaped by what they have been taught and what they have suffered and what they believe the world requires of them. Their actions are not aimed at me personally. They are aimed at the world they think they are navigating." And then he would ask himself, "Given that, how do I want to show up?" This was the practice of what philosophers call Stoic prosoph, the discipline of attention applied to the governance of assent, deciding in advance and with care which thoughts and impressions to follow and which to observe without following. It is the difference between a mind that is reactive and a mind that is responsive. Reactive minds say yes to the first thing that arrives. The insult lands and the anger rises, and the anger chooses the action. The fear arrives and the fear chooses the decision. The body bypasses the faculty of judgment entirely. Responsive minds pause in the gap. Not always long, sometimes only a fraction of a second, but long enough for the ruling faculty, that clear governing part of Marcus's inner architecture, to ask, "Is this the response I actually choose?" The pause is everything, and it is not natural. It has to be built. Marcus built it through exactly the kind of writing he left us. Every night he reviewed the day, not to congratulate himself or condemn himself, but to examine where the pause had succeeded and where it had failed. Seneca had a similar practice. He described his evening review in Letters to Lucilius, asking himself each night 3 questions. What did I do wrong? What did I do rightly? What could be improved? Not as a performance of virtue, as a genuine examination. Notice the air moving through the room for a moment. What both men had discovered, across different temperaments and different circumstances, was that the discipline of assent is cumulative. It gets easier. Not easy. Easier. The pause becomes more available. The gap between impression and response widens gradually over months and years of practice until it begins to feel like a natural part of perception rather than an interruption of it. This is the slow reward of the work. Not that difficult situations stop being difficult. Not that anger disappears, or grief lifts, or exhaustion resolves, but that you become gradually and genuinely more yourself inside them, less thrown, less carried off, still feeling everything, but feeling it from a place that is slightly larger than the feeling. That is what Marcus was building night by night in the pages that no one was supposed to see. And it is, quietly, what you are already building every time you choose to notice what you are feeling rather than simply act on it. The researcher and therapist Viktor Frankl described the space between stimulus and response as the location of all human freedom, not freedom in the large political sense, the smaller, more available kind. The freedom that exists even inside the most constrained circumstances because it lives in that gap. Marcus Aurelius was practicing that freedom daily, not always successfully, not always with the steadiness the philosophy recommended. But every time he returned to the practice, every time he opened the journal and examined the day, asked himself whether he had given assent to the right things, prepared himself for what the next morning might require, he was widening the gap by fractions, slowly, in the way that all genuinely difficult things change, imperceptibly, until one day you look back and realize you are not who you were. Let your breath come and go for a moment. Just let it move. The discipline of assent is not about becoming less alive. It is about becoming more deliberately alive. Chapter 12, Desire as the Enemy of Rest. There is a particular quality to the restlessness that arrives on a good day. You have had a day that went well, by most measures. Nothing catastrophic occurred. You ate, you worked, you perhaps connected with someone you care about. And now you are here, in the dark, with a mind that refuses to recognize that the day is complete. This was a puzzle Marcus spent considerable effort with. Not restlessness born of crisis. Restlessness born of wanting. The Stoics had a technical term for what Marcus was examining here. They called it epithumia, appetitive desire, the basic human orientation of reaching, not necessarily toward bad things. Reaching itself as the default mode. We reach toward pleasure, toward comfort, toward certainty, toward the validation of others, toward the resolution of ambiguous situations, toward the version of tomorrow that feels safer than the version that might actually arrive. And there are two kinds of silence that live inside all of this. One is the silence of a person who has arrived somewhere, who has set down what they were carrying and feels the particular weight of its absence. A good, settling quiet. The other is the silence of a person who has temporarily run out of things to reach for and has not yet found a way to be comfortable in the gap. Marcus was deeply familiar with the second kind of silence. He wrote about it in ways that are surprisingly contemporary, the feeling of having done everything that was required and yet finding that the inner noise had not correspondingly decreased. He identified the source. We mistake the quieting of external demands for the quieting of the self. When the external demands fall quiet, the internal appetite becomes audible. And the internal appetite says, "Is this enough? Have I done enough? Am I enough?" Let your hands rest open, palms up or turned down, wherever they feel natural. Marcus recognized this as a philosophical emergency, not in a dramatic sense, but in the sense that it required a philosophical response. Not more doing, not more achieving, not more reaching. The Stoic response to epithumia was not suppression but redirection. Not stop wanting, that is impossible and not even desirable, but what is worth wanting. When you want recognition, you are wanting something whose supply is entirely in other people's hands. When you want certainty, you are wanting something the universe does not reliably offer. When you want to feel enough, through external evidence, you are building a structure whose foundations are always shifting. But when you want to act rightly, in this moment, with what you have available, that is within your power. When you want to treat the person in front of you with genuine attention, that is within your power. When you want to be honest with yourself about what you actually value, that too is within your power. The Stoics were not anti-desire. They were deeply precise about which desires were connected to flourishing and which were connected to suffering. Marcus was practicing that precision every night. It looked from the outside like a man writing quietly by a lamp. On the inside, it was a sustained effort to clean the lens through which he experienced his own wanting, to see clearly which desires were pulling him towards something genuinely good and which were pulling him in circles. The Stoics drew a distinction that is surprisingly useful here. They called it the difference between preferred indifference and true goods. A preferred indifferent is something you would choose if all else were equal: comfort, health, recognition, a favorable reputation. You can prefer these things. You can even pursue them. But they are not what your peace ultimately depends on. True goods, in the Stoic view, are things like wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation, virtues that are always within your power to exercise, regardless of whether the preferred indifferents cooperate. Marcus kept having to remind himself of this distinction. The journal is full of it, and the reminder was necessary precisely because the preferred indifferents are so compelling. They feel so much like what should matter. They are woven into the social world so deeply that it takes active effort to distinguish them from the things that actually do matter. But the effort was worth it. Because when you can hold your preferred indifferents lightly, wanting them but not depending on them, you become a different kind of person, less desperate, less reactive, more genuinely free. Let your breath settle for a moment. You are not required to want anything right now. And in the practicing, he discovered something that we will come back to much later, closer to the end of our time together. Something about what is actually left when you stop reaching, and what that stillness feels like. Chapter 13. Control, Fate, and Acceptance. The most famous idea in all of Stoic philosophy is also the most frequently misunderstood: the dichotomy of control. Epictetus introduced it clearly in his handbook, the Enchiridion. He wrote that some things are up to us and some things are not. What is up to us? Our opinions, our impulses, our desires, our intentions. What is not up to us? Our bodies, our reputations, our property, power, and fame. What is in our power is by nature free and unimpeded. What is not in our power is weak dependent, and not truly ours at all. This sounds, at first reading, like a philosophy of withdrawal, of disengagement, of not caring about anything that exists in the world. It is the opposite. Marcus Aurelius understood what Epictetus intended. The dichotomy of control is not a teaching about what to value. It is a teaching about where to locate your effort. When you exhaust yourself fighting to control things that are not ultimately in your control, the opinions of others, the behavior of circumstances, the arc of events, you spend your actual power on something that will always outrun you. When you redirect that effort toward what is genuinely within your power, the quality of your attention, the integrity of your response, the honesty of your self-examination, you find that the available power is surprising. It is not infinite, but it is real, and it is yours. Epictetus had illustrated this with characteristic directness. When someone exercises in the morning, he is not training to conquer the morning. He is training to be himself with more steadiness when the morning is over and the day begins. Make the best use of what is in your power, Epictetus wrote, and take the rest as it happens. Take the rest as it happens, not as defeat, not as passive resignation, but as the recognition that the rest, the part outside your power, is not the arena. The arena is inside. Feel the weight of your body for a moment, the solid contact. Nothing is required of you right now. Marcus found this teaching practically useful in ways that pure logic would not explain. He was facing the Antonine Plague, which eventually killed roughly 5 million people across the empire. He was managing wars along multiple frontiers. He was watching political alliances shift. He was dealing with personal betrayals by people he had trusted. The dichotomy of control did not make any of these things smaller, but it made his role in them clearer. He could not stop the plague. He could improve the response to it. He could not prevent all military defeats. He could make the best possible decisions with available information. He could not force other people to be loyal or honest or capable. He could only be those things himself. And being those things himself, clearly, consistently, without depending on circumstances to confirm that he was on the right path, was the practice that kept him from internal collapse. Viktor Frankl, who spent years in concentration camps and later wrote Man's Search for Meaning, came to a similar understanding through far more brutal circumstances. He wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." Marcus would not have said it differently. The situation is rarely the final word. The self, the choosing, responding, attending self, always gets another sentence. And this is worth sitting with for a moment because it can be misread. It is not saying that your response changes the situation. Sometimes it does, sometimes it does not. The plague does not stop because Marcus chooses equanimity. The war does not end because Frankl chooses meaning. What changes is different. And it is not small. What changes is the quality of the life being lived inside the situation. The person who responds from their own values even in impossible circumstances, is not in the same experiential state as the person who is merely buffeted by those circumstances. They are living inside the same external conditions and a different internal one. And the internal one is the one that determines what the experience actually is. This is the Stoic insight that can feel cold when explained and feels warm when lived. Marcus lived it. Not perfectly. Not without despair. Not without nights when the philosophy felt like words rather than truth. But he returned to it. He practiced it. He built, across decades, the internal architecture that made choosing possible even when choosing was hard. Let the air move for a moment. Just breathe. The situation is what it is, and what you bring to it is still yours to determine. That is the one freedom that cannot be taken, only neglected. The self, the choosing, responding, attending self, always gets another sentence. Chapter 14. Mental Clarity Through Restraint. There is a tradition in Japanese aesthetics called Ma. It translates roughly as negative space, the empty interval between objects, between sounds, between words. In Japanese architecture, Ma is not the absence of design, it is design. The emptiness is deliberate, and the emptiness is what allows everything around it to be heard. Marcus Aurelius would not have known this word, but he was practicing something very close to it. He wrote frequently about simplification, not as an aesthetic choice, but as a cognitive one. The mind that is cluttered with too many considerations, too many desires, too many voices, becomes unable to move clearly. It is not a matter of intelligence. It is a matter of available space. One of his quieter instructions to himself, repeated in various forms across the meditations, was this: think less. Not in the sense of becoming less thoughtful or less deliberate, but in the sense of reducing the number of thoughts that you give serious occupation to. He was not alone in this. Seneca, who was simultaneously one of the wealthiest men in Rome and one of the most articulate critics of wealth as a path to peace, wrote about the particular poverty of a cluttered mind. A person who thinks about 100 different things every day, he argued, effectively thinks about nothing clearly. The attention spreads too thin to penetrate anything deeply. The modern neuroscientist and psychologist who studies attention management has found the same thing, centuries later. The human working memory is limited, deliberately limited. The brain is not designed to hold everything at once. It is designed to hold what is genuinely necessary and to release what is not. What Marcus was practicing was something close to what researchers now call cognitive load reduction. He did this through simplification of values, by repeatedly returning to a small number of core commitments: justice, wisdom, courage, temperance, rather than trying to hold the full complexity of all competing goods. He also did it through restraint in his expectations of certainty. He did not demand that every question resolve before he could move forward. Something about that deserves a breath. He held incomplete answers. He acted on partial information. He acknowledged that the arc of things was longer than any one person could see. And this, the willingness to live inside the question rather than demanding resolution before proceeding, is one of the most useful things he modeled. Because the mind that demands certainty before it can rest will never rest. There is always more uncertainty. Always another variable. Always another piece of information that, if you could just acquire it, would finally settle things. Marcus learned, through decades of trying and failing and returning, that certainty was not the condition for peace. Clarity was. And clarity is different. Clarity means knowing enough about your own values to act on them, even in conditions of uncertainty. It means not needing the fog to lift before you take the next step. It means being willing to move forward into the unresolved, not recklessly, but steadily. The modern psychologist Herbert Simon, who spent decades studying how people make decisions under pressure, discovered that the highest performers in complex environments were not the ones who gathered the most information before acting. They were the ones who knew when they had gathered enough. He called this satisficing, finding the option that is good enough rather than exhausting yourself in search of the option that is perfect. Marcus was practicing something very close to this centuries before the research existed to describe it. He made a decision. He held it with appropriate firmness. He remained open to revision as new information arrived. But he did not withhold action until certainty appeared, because certainty in the governance of a vast empire facing war and plague was never going to appear. This posture extended into his private life as well. The question of whether he was doing enough as a ruler, as a father, as a philosopher, was never going to be finally answered by any available evidence. The ledger was always incomplete, always had more columns than he could see. He learned to act anyway, to move anyway, to be present anyway. Not because the uncertainty resolved, because he had come to trust the clarity he had, even while acknowledging all that the clarity could not yet see. Let the breath settle for a moment. Let what is uncertain remain uncertain, just for now. There is a different quality to the restlessness of a person who has built their peace on clarity rather than certainty. It is lighter, more curious than anxious, more oriented toward discovery than toward protection, less like defending a position and more like finding the next step on an unfamiliar path by feel. Marcus, in his later journals, seems to move in exactly that direction, less bracing against what might come, more genuinely available to what was here, still not certain, still working, but clearer, and from that clarity, something that felt increasingly like the ground he had been looking for. Now this is where the path begins to widen. And what comes next is one of the stranger, more beautiful techniques Marcus practiced alone. Chapter 15, The View from Above. There is an exercise in the Meditations that Marcus Aurelius returns to again and again in different forms across 12 books. He calls it the view from above. The practice is this: when a situation feels overwhelming or urgent or unbearably personal, pause and mentally rise. Imagine yourself lifting above it, above the room, above the city, above the empire, above the earth, until the problem below becomes, for a moment, very small. Not meaningless, not dismiss, small in proportion to everything else. From that altitude, a dispute between two officials becomes a brief friction between two frightened people, each of whom will be forgotten in 1,000 years. A war becomes a flare of violence in a long and largely peaceful stretch of human history. A personal humiliation becomes a small event in a life that contains many events, most of which will not be remembered even by the person who lived them. Marcus was not using this practice to feel nothing. He was using it to feel things at their actual size. Pierre Hadot, in The Inner Citadel, describes this as one of Marcus's most distinctive philosophical tools, what Hadot calls the cosmic perspective, and it had a specific psychological function. It reduced what the Stoics called the tyranny of the immediate. The tyranny of the immediate is the experience most of us know well. The problem in front of you right now is the only problem. The feeling you are having right now is the only feeling. The conversation you had 3 hours ago is the entire relationship. The difficult day is the entire life. The view from above dissolves this tyranny without denying that the problem is real. Here is the small detail we planted earlier, the one that changes how you read the meditations. Most people, when they learn about the view from above, assume it is a technique Marcus used when things were going badly, a crisis management tool, but he used it on ordinary days. Good days. Days when everything had gone reasonably well, because the tyranny of the immediate operates in both directions. A good day can become inflated into a peak that proves nothing else could be good enough. A small success can become evidence that you have arrived somewhere and no longer need to keep practicing. A period of calm can be mistaken for the end of difficulty rather than one of its temporary pauses. The view from above kept him honest in both directions. It kept the bad from becoming catastrophic, and it kept the good from becoming either a dependency or a distraction. Let your body settle for a moment. Feel the surface beneath you. The Taoist philosopher Lao Tzu, writing from a completely different tradition but arriving somewhere similarly spacious, once observed that water is the softest thing in nature, and yet it penetrates mountains and stone. The softness is not weakness. It is patience. It is the willingness to find the path around rather than insisting on pushing through. Marcus practiced something like this in his view from above, a kind of softening of perspective that allowed what was large to reveal its smaller scale and what seemed permanent to reveal its temporariness. And he practiced this most diligently, the meditations suggest, on the nights that felt most final, on the nights when it seemed like the thing he was carrying would never feel lighter. That is also when you are listening tonight. So let the perspective rise, just slightly, not to dismiss what is real, just to find its actual size. Chapter 16. Mortality makes the mind softer. The Romans called it memento mori. Remember that you must die. It is one of the stranger practices in Western philosophical tradition, the deliberate contemplation of your own death as a tool for living more fully. And it sounds, to modern ears, like exactly the kind of thing that would make sleep worse rather than better. But Marcus Aurelius returned to it constantly, and not as an exercise in despair, as an exercise in clarity. He wrote, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." He was writing to himself, a reminder, not a threat. The logic was this: most of the things that distress us do so because we treat them as permanent. The argument that will never be resolved, the career that will always define us, the embarrassment that will follow us forever, the wound that cannot close. Mortality is the universal solvent for this kind of thinking. Because if you actually hold the temporary nature of things, not as philosophy but as felt truth, the permanent stops being permanent. And when the permanent stops being permanent, it becomes proportionate. And when it becomes proportionate, it becomes manageable. Marcus watched many people die across the decades of his reign. The plague took people he knew. Wars took people he had ordered into battle. Old age took friends and teachers and fellow philosophers. The Stoic historian Marcus Cornelius Fronto, the tutor who had shaped Marcus's early rhetoric, died during the emperor's reign. These were real losses, not theoretical. And each one, Marcus recorded in his journals, confirmed what the Stoics had always taught. The temporary is not less valuable because it is temporary, often the opposite. We love sunsets precisely because they end. Irvin Yalom, the psychiatrist and existential psychotherapist, spent decades working with dying patients and observed something that consistently surprised him. People who confronted their mortality directly, who did not hide from the knowledge of their own ending, often reported feeling more alive than they had before, more present, more willing to say what they meant, more capable of investing fully in the life that remained. He called this the awakening experience, the moment when mortality stops being an abstraction and becomes a personal fact, and everything that follows is seen more clearly. Marcus was practicing the awakening experience every single day. Notice the air in the room, the quiet around you. This is not absence, it is presence. He was not trying to frighten himself into better behavior, he was trying to keep the temporary in the foreground. And in doing so, he found that certain things which had seemed enormously important when he treated them as permanent became very light. The opinion of someone who would eventually die, the reputation that would eventually be forgotten, the accumulation of things that would eventually belong to someone else, and in their place, certain other things became heavier. The quality of this hour, the attention given to this person, the choice made in this small moment, when no one else was watching. Marcus wrote in the Meditations that a person who has truly internalized their mortality is liberated, not burdened. Not because death has become desirable, but because the temporary nature of all things, the relationship, the opportunity, the conversation, the afternoon of sunlight on a particular surface, makes each of them feel like what they actually are. Gifts. Small, unearned, unrepeatable. He had seen enough of sudden death, through plague, through war, through the ordinary attrition of the years, to know that the future could not be taken as certain. And rather than responding to this knowledge with anxiety, he had trained himself to respond with a kind of intensified attention. Here is now. This person is here now. This moment contains what it contains, and it is enough to engage with fully, without saving part of your attention for a future that may or may not arrive in the form you expect. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, living and writing 1700 years after Marcus, described a similar orientation in a different register. He wrote that life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. The understanding, the sense of what it all meant, comes later, if it comes at all. The life itself must be committed to now, with the information available now, without waiting for the understanding to precede the living. Marcus practiced that commitment. He committed to the present moment not because he had resolved the questions about death or meaning or whether his efforts mattered, but because the present moment was the only place where anything could actually be done. Notice the quiet around you right now, the actual texture of this moment. This is the work of memento mori, done rightly, not the weight of ending, the weight of now. Chapter 17, Anger Cannot Build Peace. Marcus Aurelius wrote more about anger than about almost any other emotion. This is not, on reflection, surprising. He was governing an empire at a time of sustained crisis. He was surrounded daily by people who made decisions he considered unwise, by officials who served their own interests rather than the public good, by subordinates who failed, and superiors, in the earlier years of his reign, complicated his authority. He had ample material, and yet, or perhaps because of this, he was one of history's more patient men. The historical record suggests that he very rarely acted from anger, that he was deliberate where others were impulsive, restrained where others were retaliatory. This did not mean he did not feel it. In his journals, he is remarkably honest about the feeling, about the moments when someone's carelessness cost lives he had responsibility for, about the slower burn of dealing with the same failures again and again, despite correction, about the particular exhaustion of governing people who did not want to be governed. He felt it, and he wrote it down not to vent, but to examine. One line from the meditations that he appears to have repeated to himself in various forms: "How much more grievous are the consequences of anger than the causes of it?" Read that again, slowly. The thing that made you angry, the slight, the failure, the injustice, was a real event. It had a real size, a real duration, real consequences. But the anger followed through tends to create consequences that outlast and outsize the original cause. Words spoken in anger that take years to repair. Decisions made in anger that reverse months of careful work. Relationships damaged by a moment that the anger insisted was definitive. The consequences of the anger are more grievous than the thing that caused it. This is not instruction to swallow anger or pretend it isn't there. Marcus never pretended. There is a you scenario from the story bank that fits here. You have drafted a message, furious, 3 careful paragraphs, every sentence justified by what happened. Your finger hovers. You close the screen. The next morning, the fury has cooled, and you write 3 sentences instead, clear and honest, but without the temperature of the night before. The first draft was for you. The second draft was for the situation. Marcus understood this. He was practicing the second draft of every response. Not immediately. He was human, but as the aspiration, as the standard he kept returning to when he missed it. Let your jaw soften just slightly, and your shoulders. The Stoics did not ask you to become someone who never gets angry. They asked you to become someone who, when anger arrives, does not immediately hand it the keys. There is a gap between the feeling and the action, even a small gap, and in that gap, you are still you, still the person who values something beyond this moment's reaction. Marcus was trying to keep that gap open, on good days and bad days, in small moments and large ones. He wrote in one of the meditations something that reads almost like a conversation with himself in the middle of a difficult interaction. He is reminding himself that the person who has frustrated him is doing what they know how to do, that their character is shaped by what they have been taught and what they believe, that their behavior, however aggravating, is not something he should take as a personal verdict. He does not say this with warmth toward the person. He is not pretending the frustration is not real. He is simply refusing to let it expand beyond its actual size. And he is doing this not through suppression, but through precision. The frustration is here. It is real. It has a legitimate cause. And it is not the entire story. There is also the intention he brought to the interaction, the value he holds that the frustration has temporarily obscured, the version of himself he wants to be when the interaction is over and he is sitting by himself again, reviewing the day. That version, the one he wants to be, is always available as a point of return, even mid-frustration, even after something has been said that should not have been said. The gap closes and then reopens. The anger peaks and then falls. And in the falling, the question becomes, what do I do next? And Marcus had an answer prepared. He did the next thing that was right to do. Not perfectly, not without residue, but as a deliberate return to the person he was trying to become. That is the practice of anger management in the Stoic sense. Not management of the emotion, management of what comes after it. He kept trying, and the trying, as we will see by the time we reach the end of our time together tonight, left its mark. Chapter 18, The Inner Critic and Self-Command. There is a question a good therapist sometimes asks that stops people cold. It goes something like this. If you spoke to your closest friend the way you speak to yourself, would they still be your friend? Marcus Aurelius was asking himself a version of this question nearly 2,000 years before the question had a clinical framework. He was not, by nature, a gentle self-critic. He was precise and demanding in his expectations of himself. The records suggest a man who took his responsibilities extremely seriously, who felt the weight of failures keenly, and who was capable of extended self-reproach. But the Stoics had taught him something that complicated simple self-criticism. They taught that self-command, the ability to govern the self rather than be governed by impulse and circumstance, was the highest practical virtue, not the absence of failure, not the perfection of conduct. The ongoing exercise of attempting to govern oneself more skillfully and self-command, they argued, required accurate self-perception. Not lenient self-perception. Not harsh self-perception. Accurate. The inner critic, the voice that says you should have known better, that you are not enough, that this failure proves something definitive about your worth, is not accurate. It is a distortion. It takes a real failure, which has a real size, and amplifies it until it becomes a statement about the entirety of who you are. Marcus caught himself doing this. He wrote about it. He corrected himself not by denying the failure, but by returning it to its actual proportions. Yes, I was wrong here. What can be learned? What would be better next time? That is the end of the examination. Not, therefore I am fundamentally broken. Not, therefore I cannot be trusted. Not, therefore, what was the point? Just, I was wrong here. I will try differently. There is a simplicity in that which is harder than it sounds. Let the next breath be slightly slower. The modern researcher Kristin Neff, who has spent years studying self-compassion as a measurable psychological quality, found that people who practiced self-compassion were not, as many feared, less motivated or less accountable. They were more accurate in their self-assessments, more resilient after failures, and more willing to try again. Because self-criticism creates a climate of internal danger. And organisms do not take risks in environments of danger. Self-compassion, not softness, not excuse-making, but the kind of clear-eyed honesty Marcus was practicing, creates a climate in which accurate self-assessment is actually possible. Marcus was not trying to let himself off the hook. He was trying to keep the hook precisely sized. Because a hook that is too large, that turns every failure into evidence of fundamental inadequacy, eventually prevents the very self-examination it claims to require. You cannot honestly examine something you are afraid to see clearly. And you cannot see clearly if the looking comes with automatic punishment. The research that Kristin Neff and others have built on self-compassion suggests that the inner critic, when it becomes too loud, does not increase accountability, it decreases it. People who treat themselves with harshness after failures are more likely to avoid situations where failure is possible, which means they are more likely to avoid the very situations where growth happens. Marcus was attempting the opposite architecture. He wanted to be able to look at himself honestly, which required making it safe to look, not by lowering standards, by removing the automatic punishment from the looking. Yes, this happened. This was me on this day. What do I want to do differently? That is the entire transaction. Nothing more is required. No additional suffering earns the right to try again. No extended period of guilt improves tomorrow. The lesson is there, clearly available, the moment you are willing to see it without the added weight of verdict. There is a passage in the Meditations where Marcus writes something that is easy to miss because it is so simple. He says, in effect, you can begin again, right now, at any moment, not after sufficient punishment, not after proving that you have truly suffered for your mistake, not after winning back the right to proceed. Right now, this moment, you can begin again. That is the gift he gave himself in writing across decades of practice, and it is a gift you are also allowed to give yourself, even tonight, even after whatever the day held. Begin again. This, quietly, is one of the most useful things Marcus modeled. Not that he mastered it, he wrote about it precisely because he hadn't, but he kept trying. Which is the whole point. Chapter 19, Emotional Pain and Roman Endurance. Marcus Aurelius buried many of his children. The historical record is incomplete, but scholars believe that of the 14 children he and his wife Faustina had, at least 7, and possibly more, died before reaching adulthood. Some in infancy, some as young children, some who had lived long enough to be given names and personalities and expectations. He does not write about them often. This is not unusual for the time or culture. The emotional expression of grief in Roman Stoic tradition was deliberately restrained because the Stoics believed that excessive grief was a form of the same error as excessive desire, an endorsement of the judgment that this loss is permanent and final. But the grief is there in the silences, in the passages where he reminds himself, with slightly more force than usual, that nothing is permanent, in the places where he returns, again and again, to the question of what is genuinely within his power, in the way he writes about duty as something that requires its own kind of endurance. The Antonine Plague arrived in 165 CE and did not leave. Named after his own family, it swept through the empire with no regard for rank or philosophy. Marcus lost close associates to it. His physician Galen, who has left us the most detailed medical records of the period, described the disease in terms that suggest it moved through communities faster than the Roman public health infrastructure could respond. Marcus continued to govern through all of it, not because he was unaffected, but because he had been trained and had trained himself to distinguish between what he felt and how he would respond. This is not suppression. The researchers who study emotional regulation now understand something the Stoics intuited. Suppression is not the same as regulation. Suppression pushes the feeling down, where it continues its work in the dark. Regulation means feeling the feeling clearly and then choosing the response deliberately. Marcus was regulating. Feel the weight of your body for a moment, the quiet around you. There is a modern story that runs parallel to this. A person sitting beside someone they love in a hospital room, the machines steady and humming, saying words they should have said earlier into a silence that cannot respond. Not because the words will change anything, because they have been carried too long and the carrying has become its own kind of injury. Some words are not for the listener, they are for the speaker. Marcus wrote in that spirit. The meditations are, in part, the words he needed to say into a silence that could hold them. And the silence held them for nearly 2,000 years. The Stoics did not ask you to be free of pain. They asked you to understand your relationship to it. To know that you can feel grief without becoming grief. To know that endurance is not the suppression of feeling, but the continued movement forward, with the feeling present but not in charge. Roman endurance, in the Stoic sense, was not rigidity. It was the quiet, persistent continuation of the self through conditions that seemed to argue for stopping. It was the choosing, again and again, in small moments and large, to keep going. Not because the pain was absent, because something else was also present. Chapter 20. Why Small Moments Matter. There is a passage in the Meditations where Marcus Aurelius writes about bread, specifically about the cracks that form in the crust of a loaf of bread when it is baked. He observes that these cracks, unplanned, irregular, not part of any baker's design, have their own kind of beauty. Not because they are beautiful in any conventional sense, but because they are evidence of a real process, of heat and time and the honest nature of things. He does not make a large philosophical point about this. He just notices it, and the noticing is the point. Marcus had a practice, less formal than his morning preparation, less deliberate than his evening review, of attending to small things, of refusing to let the scale of his responsibilities cause him to stop seeing what was in front of him. This is harder than it sounds for someone in a position of high responsibility. The large view, the strategy, the systemic problem, the long-term consequence is what a leader is expected to hold. The small view, the crack in the bread, the particular quality of light in a particular hour, the expression on the face of one person in a room of many, is what gets sacrificed first when demands scale up. Marcus resisted this sacrifice. He wrote about the specific sound of a stream, about the texture of a spider's web, about the way old men and old women carry themselves, the particular gravity of accumulated years in a body that is beginning to slow. He was not romanticizing these things. He was practicing something that the French philosopher Michel de Montaigne, writing 1400 years later in his tower in Bordeaux, would describe as the essential philosophical act. Paying attention to the actual experience of being alive. Notice the moment you are in right now. The actual texture of it. Lao Tzu, in the Tao Te Ching, spoke of the 10,000 things, the infinite variety of the actual world as it is, rather than as we have categorized and arranged it. He taught that the Tao, the way of things, is not found in grand gestures, but in the continuous, specific, honest experience of what is here. Marcus was a Stoic, not a Taoist. But he arrived at something adjacent. Small moments matter, he understood, for a specific reason. Large moments happen rarely. The great decision, the defining crisis, the moment that history records, these are uncommon. What fills a life is small moments. The quality of the small moments is the quality of the life. And the quality of the small moments is determined by the quality of your attention to them. A small moment attended to fully is not a small moment. It is the entirety of what this life offers, given shape by the person who is living it. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful person on earth, wrote about bread cracks and spider webs and the way old bodies move. He was not wasting his philosophy on small things. He was practicing what he most needed to practice, seeing what was actually there, and staying with it. The Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, who spent decades teaching mindfulness and wrote about the miracle of the present moment, described this practice as one of the most radical acts available to a human being. Not radical in the sense of dramatic or public, radical in the sense of returning to the root of things. He wrote that if you cannot be present to the glass of water in your hand, you cannot be present to anything. That the capacity for presence is not expanded by trying to be present to large things first. It is built through the small, specific, unhurried attention given to whatever is here. Marcus was building this capacity in exactly that way. Not through the grand philosophical moments, though those existed, through the ordinary ones. The meal, the letter, the conversation, the quality of the light at a particular hour, in a particular season. There is a version of this available to anyone. Think of a moment from today that you moved through without fully arriving in. A cup of something warm held in your hands without being noticed. A view from a window passed without seeing. A person spoken to while your attention was already somewhere else. These are not failures. They are the ordinary condition of a mind that has learned to move fast. But they are also opportunities, retrievable, at least in spirit, even now. Let your attention move, just for a moment, to something specific in the room around you, not to analyze it, just to notice it, the way it is, the actual quality of it as it is, right now. That is the whole practice, and it is enough. He was practicing what he most needed to practice, seeing what was actually there, the small thing attended to, the large life, built from small things attended to, and staying with it. Chapter 21, Peace Hidden in Ordinary Acts. The philosopher Henry David Thoreau left his ordinary life behind in 1845 to spend 2 years in a small cabin beside Walden Pond. He was trying to understand what life actually required of him, stripped of the social obligations and economic pressures that he felt were obscuring something essential. What he found surprised him. Not revelation, not the grand simplicity he had imagined, but a deeper relationship to ordinary acts. Cutting wood, growing beans, watching the ice crack in spring, the specific quality of sound in morning before other people were awake. He came to believe that the ordinary acts of daily life were not obstacles to meaning. They were where meaning lived. Marcus Aurelius never retreated to a cabin. He had 100 million obligations that prevented it. But he arrived through a different path, at a similar understanding. He wrote about what he called appropriate action, the Greek kathekon, a Stoic technical term for the action that belongs to your role and situation, not heroic action, not transcendent action. The action that fits what is in front of you, done well, with full attention. The morning greeting given with genuine attention, the petition heard without impatience, the meal eaten with awareness of what it is, rather than as fuel consumed while thinking about something else. These ordinary acts, performed with the quality of attention Marcus was trying to cultivate, were not less than the great philosophical moments. They were the philosophical moments. And here is where the two kinds of silence return, the one we mentioned at the very beginning of our time together tonight. The first kind of silence is the silence you get when everything external stops, when the demands fall quiet and the schedule empties and you are finally, briefly, left alone. This silence is available to Marcus only rarely, but when it arrives, he writes about how surprising it is, how instead of peace, it often brings the internal noise to the surface. The thoughts that were drowned out by the demands become audible. The feelings he had no time to process during the day are still there, waiting. The second kind of silence is different, and Marcus spent years working toward it. It is the silence you carry within the noise, the inner stillness that does not require external quiet to exist, the quality of attention to the ordinary act that makes the act itself a form of peace. This is the silence of the baker who notices the cracks in the bread. It is the silence of the emperor who does not stop seeing the spider's web just because the empire requires him to see larger things. And it is available in the most ordinary moment you are living right now. Notice where your body is resting tonight. This act, this simple moment of being still, it is already a form of peace. Not something approaching peace, peace itself. In this particular configuration of body and breath and quiet room, this is what the ordinary act offers when you come to it fully. Marcus spent 20 years learning to arrive at this recognition. But the arrival is not reserved for those who have studied for 20 years. It is available in the gap between one breath and the next. Chapter 22, Marcus Among War and Illness. In the winter of 170 CE, Marcus Aurelius left Rome. He would not return, not truly, for the better part of a decade. The northern frontier, the Danube, the Germanic tribes pressing south and east, the long, difficult campaigns in what is now Hungary and Slovakia required his presence, and he gave it. He was 50 years old when those campaigns intensified. Already tired, already carrying losses that the years of plague and governance had accumulated into something heavy and specific. He was not the young man who had wept when Antoninus Pius died and handed him the empire. He was a man who had been carrying the empire for 20 years and who knew with philosophical clarity he was still working to integrate, that he would carry it until he could not. He brought his journals with him. The passages of the Meditations believed to have been written during the Danube campaigns are among the most personal. Not because they are more revealing about his feelings, he was always careful about that, but because the scale of what he was witnessing pressed the philosophical work into a different key. You can read the difference if you look. The earlier books of the Meditations have the quality of a man who is rehearsing difficult ideas, working them through, testing them against hypothetical pressure. The later books have the quality of a man who has tested them against actual conditions and is reporting on what held. What held was the simplest things. The body knows cold, it knows hunger, it knows the particular exhaustion of sustained alarm. And through all of it, the ruling faculty, the governing center of judgment and choice, can remain, if not calm exactly, then present. Available, still choosing. Story card 52 from the Story Bank. A military tent on the Danube frontier, 170 CE. The emperor who commands the most powerful army on earth is awake at night in the cold, picking up his journal. He does not write commands, he writes questions. What is it that dies? What is it that remains? These are not the questions of a man who has resolved the problem of mortality. They are the questions of a man who has been watching people die for years and is still working to understand what that means. Feel the weight of your body just for a moment, the solidity of it. The Antonine Plague was still moving through the empire during the Danube campaigns. Military camps, with their density and poor sanitation, were particularly vulnerable. Marcus watched it work. And he wrote, in the aftermath of various losses, careful not to name specifics, mindful even in private of what should not be put in writing, about the fundamental nature of impermanence. Not with despair, with something harder and more useful than despair, with clarity about what remained, the effort to act rightly, the practice of attention, the choice made again and again in conditions of loss and exhaustion and cold to be the person he was trying to become rather than the person the circumstances seemed to permit. He made that choice at 50, at 55, at 58, in the last year of his life, which he spent in Vindobona, the city that would become Vienna, where he died in 180 CE. He was still writing, still trying, still practicing. There is something almost impossible to absorb in that image. A man who has governed the most powerful empire in the world, who has watched plagues and wars and the deaths of people he loved, who is sick and tired and living at the edge of a frontier he will never leave. And he is still opening his journal at night and asking the same questions he asked when he was young. Not because he has not progressed, he has. The tone of the later books carries something the earlier books do not. But because progress in this kind of work does not mean you stop needing the practice, it means the practice becomes more genuinely yours. Less something you perform and more something you are. He wrote, he tried, he failed at times. He returned, and then, in the spring of 180 CE, in Vindobona, with his son Commodus at his side, he died. His journal survived him, which means the practice survived him, which means, in the way that matters most to us tonight, he is still practicing, still asking the questions, still returning to the same simple things. What do I actually value? Did I move toward that today? Can I try again? That continuation, that refusal to stop practicing just because the conditions argued for it, is the heart of what he left us. Chapter 23. The soul learns to yield. There is a kind of strength that looks like holding, gripping, maintaining, refusing to bend, the strength of walls and stone and foundations. And there is another kind of strength that looks from the outside like yielding. Water finding its way, the willow bending in wind while the oak breaks, the kind of resilience that survives by moving with what cannot be stopped rather than against it. Marcus Aurelius spent much of his life practicing the first kind of strength. He had to, the circumstances demanded it. An empire that felt you weakening would exploit the weakness. Political survival required a certain granite quality, a steady face, a reliable authority. But in his journals, the private documents, the pages no one was supposed to see, something different was developing, a growing comfort with what he could not control. Not resignation, not giving up. Something more precise. The ancient Taoists called it wu wei, effortless action, the willingness to move in accordance with the nature of things rather than against it. Lao Tzu had written that water, the softest thing in nature, carves through mountains by refusing to fight the stone. It finds the available path. It flows. Marcus did not read the Tao Te Ching. It was not available to him. But the philosophical territory he was exploring through Stoicism converged with it in ways that suggest the insight is not cultural. It is structural to the human experience of living inside an uncontrollable world. What the soul learns when it stops fighting what cannot be changed is not passivity. It learns to direct its energy with far greater precision. Let the next breath arrive without your making it happen. Just wait for it. It comes anyway. Marcus described this in a passage about what he called the stream of events, the continuous flow of change that passes through any life. He wrote that the wise person does not try to stop the stream. They learn to move within it, not carried away by it, moving within it. The distinction is between the person who is controlled by circumstances and the person who has found a way to act from their own center while circumstances do what circumstances do. He arrived at this slowly. He would be the first to say it. The meditations document the arrival, a gradual softening of the resistance that required so much energy, a growing willingness to let the unpredictable be what it is without requiring it to be something else. And in that yielding, in the precise, deliberate release of what could not be held anyway, he found something he had been looking for. Not peace as the absence of difficulty, peace as the ability to be fully present within the difficulty, The soul that has learned to yield is not the soul that has given up. It is the soul that has stopped spending itself on the impossible and discovered how much remains for the real. There is a word for what Marcus was building, not through dramatic effort, but through the patient, repeated practice of returning to what he valued when the circumstances pulled him away from it. The word is equanimity, not happiness, not contentment, not the performance of serenity. Equanimity is the ability to be moved by difficulty, by loss, by the genuine weight of the things that matter, without being swept away. It is the capacity to feel fully while remaining at some quiet center oriented. The Japanese have a concept called Nanakorobi Yaoki. Fall 7 times, stand up 8. This is often translated as a statement of resilience. Keep going no matter how many times you fail. But there is something deeper in it. It is not about the falling. It is about the standing up. About the quality of what rises each time after the contact with the ground. Marcus fell. He lost patience. He felt despair. He failed to meet his own standards. The journals are honest about this. And he stood up. Not the same as before exactly. A little changed by what the fall had shown him. A little more acquainted with the ground. A little less surprised by the falling. And that small reduction in surprise, that growing familiarity with the cycle of falling and returning, was itself a form of peace. Not the peace of never falling. The peace of someone who has fallen enough times to trust that they know how to find the ground again. And what settles does not feel like weakness. It feels like ground. Chapter 24. Inner Peace Without Escape. There is a fantasy that most of us carry quietly without examining it too closely. The fantasy goes like this. If the circumstances were different, peace would be possible. If the pressure would lift, if the difficult relationship would resolve, if the financial worry would ease, if the body would cooperate, if the schedule would open, then there would finally be space for calm. We are waiting, in other words, for circumstances to grant us what we think we cannot generate ourselves. Marcus Aurelius understood this fantasy. He wrote about it, not to mock it, but to examine it carefully. Because by any external standard, he should have had access to peace. He was the most powerful person in the world. He had resources without limit. If peace were a function of external conditions, he was its most likely candidate. And yet, the Meditations are not the writing of a man who found it easy. They are the writing of a man who understood, with increasing clarity as the years passed, that peace does not arrive from outside, not from the resolution of external problems, not from the quieting of external demands. It is built internally, from the materials available in the present moment. This is the resolution of the first open loop we planted at the very beginning of tonight. The 2 kinds of silence. The first kind, the silence of external conditions finally cooperating, is real and beautiful and temporary. It arrives occasionally, is enjoyed while it lasts, and ends when the conditions change, which they always do. The second kind is different. It is the silence Marcus was building through his journals, his practices, his daily return to the same philosophical exercises. It is the silence you carry, the inner room that the external world cannot enter without your permission. Not a fortified room, not a defended room, a room that is simply yours. Marcus called it, after Epictetus, the inner citadel. But his understanding of it evolved beyond what Epictetus had described. Epictetus imagined it as a fortress, something defended against the world's intrusion. Marcus came to understand it more as a practice than a place, not something you reach and occupy, something you continually return to. Let your shoulders rest. Feel the air. This room you are in tonight is yours. The psychologist and author Thich Nhat Hanh, who spent decades teaching mindfulness from within a tradition very different from Marcus's, but arrived at some remarkably similar insights, described what he called the island within, a place of stillness that each person carries, not as a destination, but as an orientation. Available in difficulty as in ease, accessible in grief as in joy, not requiring good circumstances to exist. Marcus, in his final decade, had built something like this island. He did not always live on it. He was too human for that. The journal records the departures, the moments of anger, of despair, of exhaustion so complete that the philosophy felt like abstract words rather than felt truth. But he kept finding his way back, and the path back, worn smooth by years of practice, got easier to find. That is what is available tonight. Not the permanent absence of difficulty, not the end of restlessness. The path back, the inner room, the second kind of silence, which does not require anything to change outside, only something to be kept clear within. Chapter 25. The Stoic Art of Letting Go. There are things Marcus Aurelius lists in scattered passages across the Meditations as things he is deliberately working to release. The need for his decisions to be recognized as correct. He could be right, and no one would acknowledge it, and the work of rightness was the same either way. The longing for his enemies to be exposed. Their exposure or non-exposure had no bearing on his ability to act well. The desire for the arc of events to move faster than it was moving. Events moved at the pace of events. His impatience was overhead, not output. The wish that people were different from what they were. They were what they were. His task was to respond to that reality with wisdom, not to spend effort on the imagined version. He was not listing these as achievements. He was listing them as ongoing practices, as the daily work of releasing what could not be held without cost. The Stoics had a specific term for this process. They called it the reserve clause, making decisions and taking actions with full commitment, but always with the understood addendum, if nothing prevents it. Or, in Marcus's formulation, I intend to do this if nature provides. This is not passivity. It is precision. It means acting with full effort toward what you value while holding the outcome with an open hand, doing the work, not demanding the result. Epictetus described it through the image of an archer. You draw the bow, you aim with care, you release with proper form, you do everything within your power. And then the arrow is in the air, and wind exists, and the world is the world. You cannot will the arrow to the target, you can only shoot well. Marcus extended this to every domain of his life. The relationships he could only tend, not control. The military campaigns he could only command, not guarantee. The children he could only love, not protect from mortality. The empire he could only govern, not preserve, unchanged forever. Let your hands rest open for a moment. The modern research on what psychologists call psychological flexibility, a quality associated with well-being and resilience, describes something very close to what Marcus was practicing. It is the ability to hold goals and values firmly while holding the specific outcomes of pursuing those goals with less rigidity. People who can do this, who care deeply about what they are doing without needing it to turn out exactly as they intend, tend to be more persistent, more creative, and less devastated by the inevitable failures and partial successes that make up a real life. Marcus was not naturally this way. His journal shows the effort it required, the many reminders, the returning again and again to the same practice of releasing the outcome while keeping the effort. But he practiced it, and something real accumulated. And here is what that accumulation looks like. From the inside, it looks like a person who cares deeply but does not grip, who works hard but does not demand that the work produce exactly the result they imagined, who loves genuinely but does not require the loved person to behave in ways that validate the love, who tries to govern well, to parent well, to be a decent human being, and accepts without defeat that the trying and the result are not the same thing and never were. This is the specific texture of the peace Marcus was building. Not the peace of someone who has stopped caring. He cared more than most people who have ever lived, as far as the historical record suggests. But the care was clean, unencumbered by the additional weight of demanding that the world confirm his caring had been good. That demand, the one that requires a particular outcome before the caring, can be called adequate. That is what the practice of letting go actually releases. Not the care itself, only the demand attached to it. And when the demand is released, the care becomes something different. Lighter, cleaner, more sustainable, the kind that does not burn out because it is not asking the outcome to fuel it. The archer shoots well, and then the hand opens, and the arrow goes where the world allows it to go. Chapter 26. Resting outside public opinion. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from work, but from watching. Watching to see how you are perceived. Adjusting your presentation in real time based on signals from the room. Spending a significant fraction of your mental energy not on what you are doing, but on how it is being received. Marcus Aurelius identified this as one of the primary sources of inner noise. He wrote about it with some urgency. The approval of others, their praise, their recognition, their favorable opinion is not nothing. He was not naive enough to pretend it did not feel good when it came. He was too honest for that. But he was very clear about what it could not do. It could not settle anything. No amount of external validation satisfied the inner question for more than a moment, because the inner question was not actually asking for praise. It was asking about worth, about whether the life being lived mattered, about whether the choices being made were real choices or just performances of choices. And praise, being external, could not answer an internal question. There is a kind of archetype in this, the person of authority, who can fill any room with their presence and still stands alone at night, wondering if the room was an accurate reflection of anything real. The Emperor's Mirror, in the old story. All day long it reflects back power, confidence, recognition. The mirror at night shows only the person. And the person is always smaller, quieter, more uncertain than the public version. Marcus faced this split every day. The public Marcus was the emperor, a role that required gravity, authority, the performance of certainty even in conditions of genuine uncertainty. The private Marcus, the one writing by lamplight, was working out how to close the gap between what he performed and what he actually believed. Notice the quiet around you for a moment. There is nothing being performed right now. Brené Brown, in her research on vulnerability and what she called wholehearted living, found that the people who felt most at peace with themselves were not the ones who had built the most impressive public identities. They were the ones who had the smallest gap between who they were publicly and who they were privately. Marcus was working toward that same small gap, not by abandoning his public role, but by ensuring that the private work, the journal, the philosophical exercises, the evening review, kept the private self as real as the public one. He wrote in several passages that the opinion of someone who did not know him, who knew only his title and his reputation, was not a reliable guide to anything important. What mattered was whether his own judgment of himself matched what he actually valued. This is a harder standard than public approval. It has no audience to perform for. It has no easy external measure. It requires honesty and a willingness to keep returning to the question even when the answer is uncomfortable. Marcus kept returning. That willingness to be a fair witness to yourself without the inflation that praise provides or the deflation that criticism can cause is perhaps the quietest and most demanding of all the Stoic practices. And it is the one that makes external opinion feel finally like what it actually is. Information about others, not truth about you. Chapter 27. Why praise cannot settle you. There is something Marcus Aurelius noticed about fame. Not theoretical fame, the abstract concept of being well regarded. The specific experience of being praised by large numbers of people in real time. He was praised constantly. He was, by most accounts of his contemporaries, a genuinely exceptional ruler. He was known for his fairness, his accessibility, his willingness to hear cases that lesser administrators dismissed. He was popular in the specific, practical way that makes governance easier. People cooperated, more or less, because they believed he was trying to do the right thing. And none of it, none of the praise, none of the popularity, none of the genuinely earned respect, did what part of him needed it to do. He wrote about this carefully. The problem with praise, he observed, is not that it feels good. It is that it feels good for exactly as long as it lasts, and then leaves behind a need for more. It is structurally similar to a particular kind of hunger that eating does not resolve, because the food is not what the hunger is for. Marcus understood that the hunger beneath praise-seeking was for certainty, for the feeling of being finally, definitively confirmed, for the sense that the question, "Am I doing this right?" has been answered by external authority and does not need to be asked again. But it always needs to be asked again, because the question is internal. It lives inside the person asking it, and internal questions cannot be finally answered by anything external. Kierkegaard, writing 1700 years after Marcus, in a cold room in Copenhagen, walking his restless thoughts through a city that knew him primarily as an eccentric, arrived at something similar. He wrote that life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. The understanding, the sense of whether things have been right, cannot be fully available in the moment of living. And this means you cannot use present praise as evidence of present correctness. The evidence is not in. It will not be in. Not fully, not ever. And yet the life must be lived. Let your breath settle for a moment. Just let it be what it is. Marcus's response to this was not to stop caring whether he was doing well. It was to shift the ground on which he was checking. Instead of checking against external opinion, he checked against his own values. What had he promised himself? Not the world, not history, not posterity, but himself, that he would be. Had he been that today? Imperfectly, usually. Sometimes significantly imperfectly. But the direction of the check was internal. And an internal check, unlike external praise, does not have a diminishing return. It is available again in the morning. It does not require an audience. And when the answer is honestly, not quite, not today, that answer is actionable. You can do differently tomorrow. Praise cannot tell you that. It can only tell you that someone was pleased. But only you can know whether the life you are living matches the life you are trying to live. And that knowledge, when you can hold it honestly, is the only kind that settles. Chapter 28. The Fragility of Human Plans. Seneca knew his time was short. In 65 CE, the Emperor Nero, who had once been Seneca's student, ordered him to take his own life, implicated in a conspiracy that may or may not have included him. He complied. Calmly, his biographers tell us, opening his veins and dictating to a secretary until he could dictate no more. What he had written to his friend Lucilius in the final years of his life, in letters that survived because Lucilius kept them, was a long meditation on exactly this kind of ending, not with morbidity, but with something closer to gratitude. He wrote that a person who spends their life accumulating plans for the future, plans that require time they may not have, is building on foundations that belong to someone else. The future is borrowed, not ours. Seneca. It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it. He was not criticizing. He was redirecting. The remedy for the fragility of future plans is not to stop planning. It is to stop treating the future as a guarantee. Marcus absorbed this from Seneca, from Epictetus, from his own experience of watching carefully made plans dissolve against the resistance of events. He planned extensively. He had to. Running an empire requires sophisticated long-term thinking, but he held those plans with a specific kind of looseness, the Stoic reserve clause, the archer's open hand after the shot. And this looseness was not carelessness. It was wisdom about the structure of time. There is a modern version of this recognition that arrives sometimes in the smallest way. You plan a day carefully, and something unexpected changes it. A call arrives. A person needs something. The body has different requirements than the schedule had planned for. And the choice in that moment is between grief over the lost plan and curiosity about the actual day that arrived instead. Marcus had trained himself toward curiosity, not always successfully, but as the aspiration. Let the weight of your body rest for a moment. This is what is here. This is what is real. Albert Camus, writing in the 20th century in a tradition of absurdism that had less in common with Stoicism than might be expected, but arrived at some strikingly similar places, put it this way: in the midst of winter, I found there was within me an invincible summer. The winter is the fragility, the circumstances that do not cooperate, the plans that dissolve. The invincible summer is not optimism. It is something sturdier. The capacity, developed through practice, to find the ground within yourself that does not depend on what winter does or does not bring. Marcus Aurelius lived in the winter of a difficult reign and found, through years of trying, that the summer was there. Not always warm, not always easily found, but there. And the key, which we are close to now, is that finding it does not require the winter to end. Seneca understood this from a slightly different angle. Writing to Lucilius in the final years of his life, years in which he knew, with the specific clarity of someone who has received a warning, that his time was shorter than he had assumed, he wrote about what he called the quality of ordinary days. Not the remembered peaks, not the dramatic turning points that make good stories. The ordinary Tuesday, the common Wednesday, the day that contained nothing particular except the fact of being alive inside it, with people you valued, doing work that mattered to you, in a body that was still, for the moment, reliable. He had spent years, he admitted, not paying full attention to those days. They felt too ordinary to be the point. And then, when the warning arrived, they became very clearly the point. This is the gift that the fragility of plans offers when you let it. Not fear, not dread, the specific, sobering awareness that the ordinary day is not ordinary at all, that it is the entire substance of a life presented in a form so familiar it becomes easy to overlook. Marcus received this awareness through the plague, through war, through the deaths of people he loved. He used it not as a reason for despair, but as a reason for presence. The summer is there, in the most ordinary winter, in the most ordinary day. And the key is that finding it does not require the winter to end. Chapter 29. Virtue in the Dark Hours. There is a particular kind of choice that has no audience. Not the choice that happens in public, where the social consequences of what you decide are visible and immediate, not the choice that history will record or that other people will praise or criticize. The choice made when no one is watching, when the outcome will not be known to anyone else, when the effort could easily have been withheld and no one would have noticed the difference. Marcus Aurelius was deeply interested in this kind of choice. He believed and practiced the Stoic teaching that virtue is not a performance, that justice done privately is the same as justice done publicly, and in some ways more revealing of character, because private virtue cannot be motivated by external reward. He wrote about this in several forms: the deed done at night that no one sees, the judgment rendered fairly in a case where the unfair judgment would have been simpler and no one would have checked, the small act of care towards someone who had no power to reward it. These moments, he argued, were the substance of a life, not the grand gestures that made the historical record. The small choices accumulated over years that revealed who you actually were when the performance was unavailable. Story card 53 from the Story Bank connects here. In his final year, Seneca, knowing his time was genuinely short, wrote not about death but about the ordinary days, the specific quality of a morning, the warmth of a friendship, the satisfaction of an honest conversation. The Stoics' deepest teaching, in Seneca's practice of it, was not about enduring hardship. It was about noticing what was good while it lasted. That noticing, which is a form of choice, a form of attention deliberately directed, was itself a virtue, not dramatic, not publicly visible, but real. Let your attention rest here for a moment. Just here. Marcus wrote something in the Meditations that does not often appear in collections of his famous thoughts. He wrote about the importance of not needing what you are doing to be noticed in order to do it. Most of us have experienced the deflation that comes when an effort we made, quietly, with care, genuinely, went unacknowledged. And most of us, if we are honest, have sometimes done less because we knew it would go unacknowledged. This is the natural economy of social creatures. We are wired for response, for feedback, for the signal that our effort has registered. Marcus was working against this wiring. Not to become someone who did not care about connection, he valued connection enormously, but to become someone whose quality of effort did not depend on whether the connection was present or absent.
The philosopher who was watching his own choices, the emperor who was also his own most important audience,
and in the dark hours, the private hours, the ones no history records, that audience was his only one. He tried to be worthy of it, not always successfully, but always returning. That returning is the virtue, not the perfection. The returning. Chapter 30. What Marcus wrote for himself. The Meditations does not have a title. Marcus never named the work. The title it goes by now was given by later editors trying to categorize a text that resisted easy categorization. To himself is one early title. Private Notes is another. Neither fully captures it. What Marcus was writing was something that had not really existed before in the Western tradition. Not a philosophical treatise, it makes no sustained argument. Not a diary, exactly, it is too impersonal in tone for that. Not a prayer, though it has qualities of both the philosophical and the devotional. It was a practice text. A text written not to communicate ideas to others, but to reinforce ideas in himself, to make felt what he knew intellectually, to keep warm what the demands of the day kept cooling. This is the detail we mentioned at the very beginning of tonight, the detail most people overlook when they read Marcus. He was not reporting on peace. He was practicing toward it. In writing, with the full knowledge that the practice was ongoing and that he would need to return to the same pages, the same ideas, the same simple reminders again and again, indefinitely. This is not a failure of philosophy. It is philosophy working as it actually works. The French philosopher and scholar Pierre Hadot spent decades studying the tradition Marcus was working within and identified what Hadot called the spiritual exercises at the heart of ancient philosophy. These exercises were not theoretical, they were performative. They were things you did repeatedly, with attention, with willingness to return. They were not completed, they were practiced. And the Meditations, this strange, tender, rigorous text that survived 1400 years by accident and has been in print ever since, is the record of that practice. Notice the air moving, the quiet around you. Donald Robertson, who studied the psychology of Marcus's practice and wrote How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, observes that the Meditations reads, in some passages, almost like a cognitive behavioral therapy workbook. Marcus identifies a distorted thought. He examines it, he offers a more accurate alternative. He practices the alternative in writing. He does not believe himself into a new state of mind. He writes himself toward one, and the tone of the writing changes across the 12 books. The early books, believed to have been written in his 50s during the most intense period of the Danube campaigns, have a quality of effort, of repetition that is working hard, of a person who has to remind himself of things that he knows but has not yet integrated. The later books have a different quality, not certainty, not arrival, but something closer to fluency. The ideas that required intense effort to access in the early books seem to be more available in the later ones. Not easier, more natural, something settled. Over time, through practice, through the accumulation of years of returning to the same pages in the same journal by the same lamp, something settled. That is what practice does when it is sustained long enough. Not perfection, not peace as a static condition, but a path that becomes gradually a little more familiar. And tonight, you are on that path. Chapter 31. Tranquility in Imperfect Days. Most days do not go as planned. This is not a problem. This is the nature of days. But we carry, many of us, a quiet belief that the good day, the day of genuine peace, of things working as they should, of feeling adequately rested and adequately productive and adequately connected, is available in principle and simply keeps not arriving due to specific, correctable circumstances. If only the circumstances would cooperate. Marcus Aurelius examined this belief directly. He wrote about what the Stoics called tranquillitas, a Latin word that carries some of what we mean by equanimity, but is more precise. Not the absence of disturbance, the ability to be present and functional within disturbance. Tranquillitas was not available only on good days. It was precisely not that. A peace that required perfect conditions was not peace. It was just a good mood happening to coincide with favorable circumstances. Real tranquility, the kind he was working toward, the kind that appears in the later books of the Meditations with something like earned naturalness, was available on imperfect days. On days when the decisions he made turned out to be wrong, on days when his body was tired and his patience was shorter than he wanted it to be. On days when the news from the frontier was bad and the news from the plague was worse, and the faces around him carried the weight of a world that was not going to cooperate. Those were the days that tested it. And what he discovered across years of testing was that tranquility was less about the conditions and more about the quality of return. Not whether he left the center, but how quickly he came back. Not whether difficult things made him less steady, but whether he could find his footing again after they had let your body rest fully for a moment. The floor or surface beneath you is holding you completely. This is the distinction that makes the whole practice livable. Because if peace required perfection, it would be unavailable to everyone. The imperfect days are not the exception. They are the material of life. But if peace is a quality of return, a capacity to find your footing again, refined through practice, available even in conditions of genuine difficulty, then it is always technically available. Not always easy, not always immediate, but always there if you know where to look. Marcus described this as keeping the ruling faculty clear, not pristine, not untouched by difficulty. Clear, available, capable of seeing what is actually there rather than what anxiety believes is there. A camera lens covered in dust cannot function as a lens, no matter how good the light. But you do not need a new lens. You need to clean the one you have. Marcus was cleaning his lens every night. In the journal, in the review, in the return to simple things, what do I actually value? Did I move toward that today, however imperfectly? Can I try again tomorrow? And here is what made this practice sustainable across decades of use. He was not measuring against perfection. He was measuring against direction. Not did I arrive, but Was I facing the right way? The difference between those two measures is the difference between a practice that is perpetually failing and one that is perpetually alive. If you measure against arrival, you will almost always fall short. Arrival implies completion, and the work of becoming the person you want to be is not the kind of work that completes. It continues. Not because you are deficient, but because growth is continuous, and growth is the condition of being alive. If you measure against direction, are you moving toward what you value, however haltingly, however imperfectly? Then every day that contained any genuine effort is a successful day, because the effort is the success. The direction is the achievement. Marcus understood this. Not at first. The early journals have a quality of someone who still expects, somewhere beneath the philosophy, to eventually stop needing the practice, to arrive, to have the internal work complete. By the later books, something has shifted. He is not trying to finish the work. He is trying to do the work well today, with what today offers. And that reorientation from destination to practice, from arrival to direction, is perhaps the quietest and most useful thing he learned across the full span of his journaling years. It is also available, without any of his years of preparation, on any ordinary Tuesday, or tonight, on whatever kind of day today was. Yes, always yes. That is the answer the imperfect day always gets. Yes, I can try again. Chapter 32. Self-worth beyond achievement. There is a man in his 50s who retires and discovers in the first weeks of freedom a terror he did not expect. Not boredom, not the loss of structure, the question, who am I when I am not useful? He had built his identity carefully across 40 years of professional life around what he could produce, what problems he could solve, what his presence made possible for others. And the identity had worked. It had given him a clear answer every morning to the question of what the day required of him, and now the day was empty. And the question had no ready answer. And what he found in the silence was not freedom, it was the version of himself that had always been there, underneath the productivity, beneath the performance that he had never learned to value. Marcus Aurelius was, in important ways, exactly this man. He was the emperor. He was, professionally and publicly, one of the most significant figures in the history of Western civilization. And in his private writing, he was working constantly to ensure that his sense of self was not entirely located in the role, because he knew what happened when it was. The role would eventually end. Roles always end. And if the self had lived inside the role rather than alongside it, the ending of the role would be, in a very real way, the ending of the self. He practiced what the Stoics called apatheia, not apathy in the modern sense, not caring about nothing, but the ability to be present in a role without being defined by it, to inhabit a position without letting the position determine your worth. This is one of the hardest things, because worth that does not depend on external achievement or external recognition has to rest on something internal, something that does not have an obvious measure. Marcus anchored his worth to values, not to outcomes. Did he try to act justly? Did he try to be honest? Did he try to be courageous when courage was required? Temperate when temperance was required? Wise when wisdom was required? These were the measures, and they were available regardless of what the external world was doing with the results of his effort. Just notice where you are for a moment. The simple fact of being here. There is a line from the story bank that fits here. The mirror that a person looks into after years of not really seeing their own face. They see age, tiredness, and then, underneath that, survival. Every line is a year they made it through. The face in the mirror is not who you were. It is proof of who you became. Self-worth that is built on becoming, on the character that accumulates through years of choosing imperfectly but deliberately, is not vulnerable to the endings of roles. It is not vulnerable to what the external world decides to recognize or not recognize. It lives in the gap between who you chose to be and who you managed to be. And that gap, however wide or narrow, is always a story of effort. And effort, sustained over years, is worthy. Even when no one is counting, even when the role has ended, even tonight, there is something important hiding in the word worthy. We tend to use it as a verdict. Something is worthy or it is not. Someone is worthy of respect, of recognition, of belonging, or they have not yet earned the designation. Marcus used it differently. For him, worthiness was not a verdict rendered by others. It was a quality of attention you brought to what you were doing. A letter written with care to someone who might not read it carefully, worthy. A decision made with honesty, in conditions where dishonesty would have been easier and gone unnoticed, worthy. An hour spent with a child, genuinely present, rather than merely physically available, worthy. These small acts of care, brought to the ordinary moments of a life, were the substance of what Marcus valued. Not the outcomes, the acts themselves. The Stoics called this living in accordance with the logos, the rational principle that underlies all things, the pattern of a life well directed. You do not know what the outcomes of your actions will be. History may record you, or it may not. The people you affect may acknowledge it, or they may not. But the quality of the directing, the care, the honesty, the attention brought to each act, that is entirely yours. Marcus made this case to himself repeatedly across the meditations, not as self-reassurance, as a philosophical position, and it holds, because in the end, the only measure of a life that does not depend on the cooperation of anything outside yourself is the measure of the effort you brought to living it. And that measure is always available. No one else controls it. No external circumstance can revoke it. It exists precisely where the Stoics said it always existed. Inside the one place that is yours. Even when the role has ended, even tonight, chapter 33, the long journey toward enough. We pause here for a moment, not to meditate, not to fix anything, just to notice. The practice I want to offer you now is simple. It does not require you to do anything physical. It does not require effort or discipline or any kind of performance. It only asks that you notice. You have been listening for some time now. Your body has been here throughout, holding you, breathing, doing the quiet work that bodies do without being asked. Bring your attention to wherever your body feels heaviest right now. Maybe your legs, maybe your shoulders, maybe the back of your head against the pillow or your hands resting where they are. You do not have to change anything. Just notice. Imagine for a moment that you are holding something. Not a physical thing, a weight, something you have been carrying, a concern, a regret, an expectation of yourself that has not been fully met. Feel how long you have been holding it. Notice the grip. You did not grip it to hurt yourself. You gripped it because at some point it felt important to hold tightly. Because holding felt like caring and not holding felt like giving up. But Marcus Aurelius spent 20 years learning the difference between gripping and caring. And the difference is this. Caring asks you to bring your full attention to what matters. Gripping asks you to hold so tightly that the blood stops moving. Slowly, not forcefully, not with effort, let the grip soften. You are not throwing anything away. You are not pretending the weight is not real. You are simply releasing the tightness around it. Feel the difference between holding and allowing. The concern is still there. The regret is still there. The expectation is still there. But the tension in the grip softens. And in that softening, something strange happens. The thing you are holding seems to find its actual size, not the size it was in the grip, which was the size of everything. Its actual size, which is manageable. Marcus wrote near the end of his years of practice, enough, not as resignation, as recognition. Enough. This moment as it is. Enough. Not because everything is resolved, but because what is actually here in this moment is already everything. Let that be true for a moment tonight. You do not have to believe it fully. Just let it be here, alongside everything else. And breathe. Chapter 34. When the mind stops arguing. In the days ahead, if you find yourself returning to something we have sat with tonight, here is a gentle path forward. 7 small invitations, 1 for each day. You do not have to do any of them. They are not assignments. They are the kind of thing Marcus Aurelius might have written in his journal as a gentle reminder, something to try if the day offers room for it. Day 1, notice 1 grip. Today, at some point, notice something you have been holding tightly, not to release it, not yet, just to see it. Name it silently, the way Marcus named his disturbances. There you are. Just noticing is enough for today. Day 2, find the gap. 3 times today, when something small frustrates or startles you, look for the gap, the space between what happened and your response. Even a fraction of a second. Just notice that the gap exists. You do not have to do anything differently in it yet. Just locate it. Day 3, One small act for no audience. Today, do one small thing with care, a task, a kindness, a piece of work that no one will notice or praise. Do it as well as you can. Notice what it feels like to bring your full quality to something that does not need to perform. Day 4, the size of the worry. When an anxious thought arrives today, try what Marcus practiced. Describe it in plain, material terms without the story around it. Not everything is falling apart, but this specific thing is uncertain. Notice how much smaller the actual thing is without the story that has been growing around it. Day 5. What you cannot control. Choose one situation that has been taking your energy, something you have been trying to manage that is not finally in your control. Say quietly, honestly, this is not mine to hold. Not with defeat, with the precision Marcus spent years practicing, and notice where the released energy goes. Day 6, the second kind of silence. Find 5 minutes today, just 5, where nothing is required of you. No phone, no task, no performance, just you in whatever room you are in. Let the inner noise be what it is. Do not try to quiet it. Just give it room. And notice that you are still here, underneath all of it. Day 7, begin again. Tonight, before sleep, think of one moment from the week when you did not respond the way you wanted to. Not to criticize yourself, just to see it clearly. And then say, the way Marcus said it in his journal in the lamplit room at the end of a long day, I can try again tomorrow. Let that be enough. It is more than enough. These 7 days are not a program. They are what Marcus was doing in spirit every day of his adult life. Not perfectly, not without frustration, just returning again and again to the simple practice of trying. Chapter 35, a final lesson in acceptance. Marcus Aurelius made one decision in the final years of his life that scholars and historians still find surprising. Not a political decision, not a military one, a personal one. He kept writing. This seems unremarkable. He had been writing for decades. But what is remarkable is what he was writing as the end of his life became something he could no longer treat as an abstraction. He was not writing about death. He was writing about gratitude. Specifically, he was writing about the ordinary things, the particular quality of autumn light, the way a fire settles when the main fuel is consumed and only the slow embers remain, the specific texture of a life in its later season. He had spent years writing about what he was trying to become. In the final period of the meditations, something had shifted. He was writing about what he was. Not with satisfaction exactly. He was too honest for easy satisfaction. He was still aware of the gaps, the ways he had fallen short, the anger that had come when he had intended patience, the grief that had come when he had intended peace. But beneath those gaps, something had settled. The third open loop we planted tonight resolves here. The decision Marcus made late in his life, the one that surprised those who knew him, was to stop treating the journey as something that would one day be complete. Not to lower his standards, not to give up, to accept with full, genuine honesty that the practice would never end, that the returning would always be required, that he would never arrive at peace as a final destination, and to find in that acceptance something he had not been able to find as long as he was still expecting arrival: rest. Not the rest of having finished, the rest of having finally stopped treating not yet finished as a problem. Viktor Frankl, who survived conditions far more brutal than anything Marcus ever faced, wrote that there is always a space between what happens to us and how we choose to respond. That space, that inner freedom, cannot be taken. It can be neglected, it can be forgotten, but it cannot be taken. Marcus spent 20 years finding that space in himself, and what he discovered at the end was that it had always been there. He had not been building it, he had been clearing away what was obscuring it. And in the clearing, what was always present became available. This is the lesson that lives at the end of the long practice. Not that you will achieve peace, but that peace is already here, underneath what the day has deposited, underneath what the year has accumulated, underneath the weight you have been carrying for long enough that you have forgotten its shape. You do not have to build it. You only have to stop covering it. That is what Marcus Aurelius, in a military tent by the Danube River, in the last years of his life, finally allowed himself to know, and it is available to you tonight, in the ordinary silence of this particular room, just as it is. Chapter 36. Sleep beneath the inner citadel. The room is quiet now. It was quiet at the beginning when we started this journey together. And it is quiet now. After everything we have followed, the campaigns and the journal entries, the lamplight and the philosophy, the grief and the practice, and the slow, patient accumulation of a life, the restlessness that brought you here may still be present. That is fine. Marcus Aurelius's restlessness was still present at the end of his life too. He was too honest a reporter to pretend otherwise. But alongside the restlessness, something else. The knowledge, not as an idea but as a felt thing, that the restlessness is not all that is here. Beneath it, something that does not move, that does not panic. That has been here the whole time, holding you the way the ground holds everything that rests on it, quietly, without requiring you to notice it, simply being what it is. That is the inner citadel, not a fortress, not a place of defense, just the part of you that is still here, after everything the day has brought, still breathing, still capable of beginning again. Let your body rest completely now. If there are thoughts still circling, and there may be, let them circle. You do not need to stop them. You only need to know that you are not identical to them. You are the one who can watch them, and the one who watches is calm, has always been calm, even in the difficult hours, even in the years that asked more than seemed possible, even in the grief and the uncertainty and the long nights when the answer did not arrive. Underneath all of that, this, the breathing, the ground beneath, the quiet that does not require perfect circumstances to exist. Marcus Aurelius wrote near the very end of his journals a line that scholars believe may have been among his last. He wrote that all things are the same, beginning and ending, and in between the chance, the improbable, remarkable, precious chance to pay attention. He paid attention, imperfectly, with great effort, with many returns, and something real accumulated. In you, tonight, something may also have moved, not solved, not resolved, not finished, but moved. The mind that was arguing may have, for a moment, stopped. The grip that was holding may have just slightly opened. That is enough, more than enough, for Marcus Aurelius, ruling the most powerful empire in the world, writing by lamplight in cold tents and warm chambers, getting it right and getting it wrong, and always returning. For him, enough was the final gift of the practice. For you, tonight, in whatever room you are in, with whatever the day has left behind, the same gift is available. You have been here, you have listened. You have, in the simple act of being present, done the work. And now the room is quiet, and the breathing continues without your help. And the night holds you the way Marcus discovered everything held him when he finally stopped gripping and let it sleep now.